welcome. I'm Rob Carrillo from Trust IT Services. Welcome to our webinar for EOSC-Pillar, the role of policies for a sustainable EOSC. Let's just wait for a couple more people to come in. In the meantime, perhaps you can type in the chat where you're coming from. It'd be kind of nice to know, and also at the same time test the chat functionalities, especially since the Q&A will be done through that. Just a note there that you can choose who you send the chat to, either to all panelists or to everyone else. So that's how you can use the chat functionality. At the moment, we have 28 attendees and counting. Okay. I see we have a guest as well. Okay, in the meantime, while we're waiting for everyone to come in, I'll just give you a couple of reminders for today's webinar. Just a second. I hope you're seeing my screen. So a couple of reminders. This webinar is recorded and will be published online. The slides and the recordings can be found at the main event page. So you can expect that for the next 2 days after this webinar. I would recommend that you do keep your questions at the end of the session, just in case your question might be addressed at a later slide. Also, questions will be done through the Zoom chat functionality. You may be given permission to speak, so just prepare for that in case we ask you to elaborate further in your question or comments. In case your question is not addressed, we will do our best to get back to you after the event. We'd like to remind you that this webinar is held in cooperation with the EOSC Secretariat project. The contents and information gathered during this webinar will be reused, of course, without the personal data. And this will be reused by the EOSC-Pillar for supporting the EOSC. With that, I see we have more than 30 attendees now. I pass the floor to Federica Tanlongo, who leads the work package 4 in EOSC-Pillar. Federica.
Welcome, everybody, to this live event on the role of policies towards establishing a sustainable and successful EOSC. My name is Federica Tanlongo, and I will be your hostess in this workshop. So first of all, introductions. I come from GARR, the National Research and Education Network in Italy, and more to the point, one of the animators of the National Open Science Cloud Initiative, ICDI. We believe that establishing open science initiative at the national level is one of the key pillars from a successful EOSC, and here's the namesake for our project. So today we are here to discuss policies at several levels: international, national, and organizational level. And we believe that all these levels, policies on all these levels, they can contribute to foster principles of open science and open data, and are indeed central to the success of so many EOSC-related objectives, and more generally, to the uptake of open science as a new way of doing science. So with representatives from funding bodies and universities, as well as other EOSC stakeholders, we will discuss the role and consequences of policies on national and institutional level and how those interact. So today's agenda includes 2 presentations and a panel session. The first presentation is by Lisa Hönegger from EOSC-Pillar and University of Vienna, and she will sketch the results of the national initiative surveys. We carried out and will present the status quo of existing policies on a national and institutional level in the pillar countries, taking into account different stakeholders. The second presentation by Joy Davidson from DCC and Vanessa Proudman for SPARC Europe will present an overview of national policies and strategies based on the results from SPARC Europe and the FAIRsFAIR project. So before we start with Lisa's presentation, let me remind, if you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat. I will do our best to follow up. Lisa, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just waiting until my slides are shared. In the meantime, welcome also from my side. As Federica already said, my name is Lisa Hönegger. I'm from the University of Vienna and AUSTA, the Austrian Social Science Data Archive. And I would like to start off this webinar and to present some results from our National Initiative Survey, and especially on the topic of policies. And I would also like to give you a little background information on our project on the next slide. So EOSC-Pillar is one of the EOSC support projects and aims at coordinating national and regional initiatives on open data and services in 5 countries, in dark blue on the map that you can see on the right. So we covered Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, and Italy. And one aspect that is quite very prominent in the discussion on readiness for EOSC or sustainability of initiatives and countries is the topic of policies. So the information whether there are national and institutional policies in place, what they address, what the consequences are, that's all very relevant in the implementation of EOSC. And this is why today we want to give an overview of the findings of the state of the policy framework that we gathered in our National Initiative Survey, especially concerning institutional policies. And then we want to set this in contrast or also in connection later to other findings on national policies for the panel discussion later. And let me also briefly put our findings into context. So please, on the next slide, I will briefly introduce our survey activities. And again, on the next slide, you will see the key points of our survey. So as one of the regional projects, we wanted to create a comprehensive picture in the region on the status quo of research infrastructures. And we have therefore conducted a survey among universities, funding bodies, research infrastructures, and also e-infrastructures to better understand the European landscape. We address and analyze aspects on different levels. So we cover organizational aspects, technical, but also legal issues relevant to managing data. And the survey covers aspects also comprising the whole data lifecycle. So we started off from data collection and processing to archiving, dissemination, and finally reuse. We did this in October and November 2019. So this is the point of data collection for all the information I will be giving you. On the next slide, you can see the target groups and the topics that we addressed and included into our survey. So we have universities, funding bodies, research infrastructures of national relevance, including ESFRIs, and e-infrastructures. And for e-infrastructures, we included a group of data repositories, data archives, data and computing centers, grid infrastructure, HPCs, NRENs, and also national museums with digital archive. The topics that we address range from business models and service level agreements, as well as user support, to access conditions and access policies of services, but also of data, AAI and licensing, various aspects of data management and the FAIR principles, and also user communities and services. And on the next slide, we can see an overview of the target groups and their response rate. So overall, within these 5 countries, we contacted more than 2,200 organizations and gathered in total 688 responses. So this gives us a response rate of 31%, which means that 31% of all addressed institutions responded to our survey. And the highest response rate here you can see was among the group of infrastructures with about 44%. And as you will see on the next slide, the survey data and also all additional documentation, so the questionnaire and the methods report, are available under the following GUI, which you can see on the slide in the repository OSTA. And also we have a full report on all the results. It's available on Zenodo also on the mentioned link. And now moving on to the next and main section, which is the results from the survey on open science policy. So we want to focus today on the data that we gathered, especially regarding the topics of policies and regulations concerning open science and data management. As we already said, these are important instruments for data sharing. And we have 2 groups, which we kind of highlight here. So these are funding bodies and universities, as they are very relevant stakeholders in this regard, and they can encourage and promote fair data, but also create the basis for researchers to apply open data principles. And also they have the means to enforce regulations regarding the handling of data on their associated researchers, and also make open data practices more attractive to their researchers. For example, by creating incentives or by raising awareness or by providing the necessary support structure. So from those 2 groups, I will start with regulations and policies by funding bodies. So this is the first results and the first group that we want to look at. And in the graph on the next slide, you will have all the information in an overview. So the items on the left cover different aspects of open science and open data. And we wanted to know whether or not there are any kind of rules in this area. And as for the response categories, we range between institutions having no regulations at all to them having regulations with obligations to follow open science principles. And what we find in our data is overall that funding bodies most frequently have mandatory rules for all or some grants concerning data management plans with 40%. So this is the biggest group. And open access publications following by 36%. And then followed by open research data, 32%, and the compliance of data to the FAIR principles also with 32% of the funding bodies. The next group would be the publication of data in a repository. So 28% on average of the funding bodies that responded have a regulation in this regard. And the long-term availability of research data with also 28%. And what we can also see, what is least common are rules concerning the publication of data in a certified repository. So from the 25 funding bodies that responded, only 1 indicated that they have adopted such regulations for all their grants, and another funding organization enforces this rule on some grants. And in addition to these mandatory regulations, it is also noteworthy that funding bodies also frequently encourage grant recipients to follow recommendations concerning aspects of open science. And for instance, around 40% of the funding bodies indicated to encourage to comply to open data or to publish data in a repository. And with the next slides, we want to take the same look, but this time at universities and their usage of open science policies. And on the graph here, you can see on average, open access regulations are by far more common than any other official regulations. With 56% of the universities have adopted written regulations or policies concerning open access publications. Although the country differences here are quite large, as for example, all Belgian universities in our dataset have adopted such a policies, and substantially less universities in other countries. And across countries, we can see that around 28% of the universities have on average adopted written regulations or policies regarding the publication of data in a repository, and also regarding research data management. And about a fifth of the universities have written rules or policies in place regarding the long-term availability of research data, the publication of data in a certified repository, and the compliance of data to FAIR principle. Official regulations concerning open research data are least common here among universities, with a mean across countries of 13%. And in addition to written regulations and publicly available policies, many universities have adopted informal regulations as well. And for most items in these questions, about 1/3 of the universities have adopted on average these kind of informal regulations. And in the end, however, the largest group on average are still universities without any regulations on open science or on open data. And what can we now conclude from these findings? So on the next slide, you will see some tendencies that we deducted when comparing countries with each other. So compared to the other countries, we find that Austrian universities are on average more reluctant to adopt regulations on open science and open data. Whereas, for example, Belgian universities are quite the enthusiasts in this group concerning open access publications, and they tend to engage more frequently in regulations, especially informal regulations on open science and open data than any other countries in our sample. German universities more often have either formal regulations or none at all. And for France, we can observe that French universities lie close to the mean for adopting formal regulations, but they prefer informal regulations to having no regulations at all. And lastly, the results for Italy, they mostly lie close to the mean across countries, which was presented in the slide before. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for the attention, and moving on to the next presentation.
Thank you, Lisa. And the next in line is Vanessa. The floor is yours. You're mute.
When will I ever learn? So I'm Vanessa Proudman, and I'm the director of SPARC Europe, and Joy from DCC and myself, we're looking forward to telling you why policy is an important instrument to accelerate embedding FAIR into the research lifecycle. So how does policy need to adapt to that? So that's what we've been looking at with the FAIRsFAIR project, and I'm going to report on a little bit of work that SPARC Europe's been doing, and also some research results in international policies. So that's excluding the funders, even though they are very significant, the national funders. Next slide, please. So for those of you who don't know FAIRsFAIR, DCC and SPARC Europe, so ourselves, we are project partners. It started in March 2019. Our focus is on fostering fair data culture and the uptake of good practices. And policy is very much part of that. And that's what we're heavily involved in. Next slide, please. So there is a wide range of national policies, at least 14 in place. I've been looking at national policies over the years, also with DCC. So you can have some policies that are very closely aligned with the European Commission policy, like in Slovenia, but then you have others like the National Plan for Open Science in France, which is a broader open access and open science policy as well, or you have specific ones focusing on the sharing of research data and on access, like in Norway. And then on the other scale, you also have in the Slovak Republic, you have research data being addressed in their Open Government Partnership National Action Plan. Next slide, please. So DCC and ourselves, we have over the last 3 years, twice a year provided an update on national open science policy, have been following that. The recent publication also includes information on COVID-19 policies and how that's affected the scene. And we've also reported on the EOS project policy activities in there. In total, we've had about 5,000 downloads across the 3 years on that report, but we're really looking to refresh it because there are so many of us actually looking at this. Next slide, please. What SPARC Europe did also last year, and I'm only going to touch on this very briefly because we want to focus on national policies, is we looked at funder policies and the rewards and incentives for open science. We did this in consultation with Science Europe, who's also on the panel today, with the European Foundation Centre and with ALIA. That report came out last year. Next slide, please. And there, similarly, we saw that there were far more open access policies in place, still not 100%. Next slide, please. What we saw was actually that there were still very many research funders with no research data policy in place. So that this is still very much an area in flux, and we heard that from the previous speaker as well, although there is also quite some development. Next slide, please. So let me now give you some insights into the research that we've been doing for FAIRsFAIR. And we've been looking at national policies and at FAIR. So how do we really embed FAIR into those national policies so that it really gets well embedded into the research lifecycle? So first of all, what references to FAIR do national policies at the moment have? And this is actually data from looking at last year, so to the end of last year. So we would like to see FAIR specifically mentioned to promote the culture of fair practice. We saw that in several countries, but by no means in all of those. Next slide, please. We also found that it's not always clear for researchers what is understood by data and sharing data, what types of data. So we also looked at the definitions given on research data, and this is actually a very wide spectrum. If you look at, some are quite high level, quite vague, and bring even more confusion perhaps to some of the researchers, and some are really very specific and concise. Next slide, please. So here we have an example from France, which is a very nice, concise description of what is meant by research data and what they want to promote or require. Next slide, please. What about mandates to sharing data? So we see that the majority recommend rather than require it. There are several countries, or a couple of countries, who require it, and one is hoping to introduce a mandate later on. Next slide, please. DMPs, of course, we have more again recommending DMPs. This is the national policies, remember. We have several countries requiring it, but the question is also when should DMPs be shared? Is it pre-award or post-award when national policies are also funders, or is it monitored throughout? We found no instances of requirements to submit DMPs throughout the process and for that to be monitored by the national policymakers. Perhaps no surprise there. Next slide, please. Now, when we're talking about mandates to sharing data, we know, of course, that there are some very valid instances where data cannot be shared, as long as it's as open as possible, but as close as necessary. So we also looked at, are there specific exceptions on data sharing allowed and described, as I mentioned on some of the slides, relating to national security or privacy, trade secrets, for example. You see that the majority do have some exceptions. Next slide, please. But if you look at the graph on the left, we also asked if, we also analyzed if exceptions are allowed, are justifications required? So why I was interested in looking at that, let's look at the next slide. So most did not have justifications. What's important is if there is an exception, that it's not used as an easy excuse to not share data. So we want to promote that it's justified and that we know that if data is closed, where that might be, So next slide, please. So Slovenia, they also call for research data that's not made available, for example, for some basic metadata to be provided. So then at least you know where that is. Next slide, please. And just one back, that was a little bit too quick. Yes, because in Norway, they make the point also that, of course, certain data can be temporarily closed and you can then unlock it at a later stage. So I think that's something to be mindful and important. So there are lots of lessons that other policy makers can take from some of these policies in place. Next slide, please. Now, this is a real key one. So if we're thinking about encouraging FAIR and encouraging researchers to contribute and share their research data, how are they going to get rewarded? It's really key that also national policy makers, how they evaluate the research, that they also legitimize research outputs like research data, seeing that as legitimate research output in its own right. So it's important to recognize authors in a standardized way. So there are expectations on data citations, but few, and actually looking at that in practice, we're not there yet there, but this is really important that national policymakers and funders really embrace research data as an important output when they evaluate research. Next slide, please. Okay, my last slides. Without monitoring that policy, how do you know about compliance? And so we also asked the funders last year, if you look at the bars in the middle and on the right, related to research data policy and DMPs, the light blue unfortunately shows that they don't yet monitor compliance. I know that work is being done, and I think with Science Europe as well, on looking at how that can be monitored. Next slide, please. We also asked what were the reasons for you not being able to monitor or not deciding not to monitor. It was largely not having the monitoring infrastructure or tools in place, or lack of resources, really, apart from if you don't even have a policy that requires monitoring. So, and I think what we're looking at is how can you reward good practice as well as perhaps sanction the practice you're not looking for. So I think I'm going to pass on now to Joy to talk about
I'll just flag up, there was a question I saw flash up about the x-axis on the graph, if you could explain that.
Which one?
For the monitoring slides, I think somebody had asked about the x-axis, what was meant by that? Is that a percentage?
On this particular slide or going back?
Yeah, I believe so.
So the numbers, those, so the numbers, you had about 14 national policies that I was looking at before, and now these are the numbers of policymakers that replied. We had about 65 funders who contributed to this study, and they were mainly national funders. And then it's the reasons for not monitoring the open science policies.
Thanks.
So I'm going to pass it on to you, Joy, now.
Okay,
to
thank
talk
you.
about some of the recommendations. So what could change for policies to become more fair? Thanks.
Great. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Great, thank you very much. So Vanessa's given a little bit of a flavor of some of the findings from the SPARC Europe policy reports and some of the other work we've done. I'm going to pick up a little bit on some of the FAIRsFAIR policy landscape assessment work. So up until the end of 2019 last year, we spent some time looking at the policies of 42 funders, publishers, and HEIs, who we felt were fairly well advanced in terms of open science, embracing these concepts. And we characterized the policies to try and get a comparison. We looked at those in relation to Turning FAIR into a Reality report to try and see how well the kind of landscape reflects the actions that were in the Turning FAIR into Reality report. So that report came out late last year. On the back of that, we ended up coming up with a set of 22 policy enhancement recommendations. These are targeted to a wide range of policymakers. So it's not just national policymakers. It touches on institutional service providers and repositories as well. So for the next couple of slides, I'm just going to give you a flavor of a few of these 22 policy recommendations that we came up with. And the first one that actually, can we go back to the last slide? I just wanted to pick up, sorry about that. The three kind of policy recommendations I just wanted to pick up on this first slide are that if we are looking to come up with ways to monitor policies as a way of looking at EOSC readiness, one of the things we really need to be able to do is to compare the policies. And as I mentioned, we came up with a way to characterize the policies we looked at for the FAIRsFAIR landscape assessment. We broke it up into 42 different policy components, which is quite a lot, but it gave us a way to try and compare different policy elements. So I think one of the things we as a community need to do is to agree on a sort of minimum set of common policy elements that we would want to see in open science policies, and to be able to agree on how we would describe those. The other thing that I think we wanted to bring forward as something that is a priority is that we need to make sure that the policies are accessible. So we want, obviously, the most current policy to be clearly visible. These are often on the websites of funders and publishers and institutions. But we know that, you know, sometimes funders will change their policies halfway through a program. So half of the projects up until a certain date will be on one policy that they have to adhere with, and projects funded after that date will be on a different policy. So we do also need to be able to access clearly version policies through persistent identifiers, and these should be made available via registries. One of the other things we think is really key is that we have to start to emphasize not just on being able to say that policy elements are either in the policy or not. We have to understand more about what each of those means. So for example, if we have a requirement to keep data for a certain amount of time, we will need to be able to then specify what that period of time is. Is it 5 years after the life of the project or something like that? So we need to have that level of understanding what the rules are if we ever want to support machine actionability. And I think these three policy recommendations fit in very well with the strategic research and innovation agenda. They had a landscape monitoring related recommendation, which is looking to try and get to monitor standardized national open science and FAIR data strategies, including the description of policies. So I think, you know, if that is to be realized, we do need to make these three things happen. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. The other thing that I think we wanted to pick up on, so Vanessa mentioned that we are keen to see FAIR reflected in the policies. And I think one of the key things to flag up here is that we realize it doesn't always have to be an explicit reference to FAIR. In many of the policies we looked at, they are implicitly referring to FAIR activities. So I think we need to be flexible enough to be able to allow that to still be the case. So it can't be completely binary where if you don't refer to FAIR, you're not EOSC ready. If you refer to FAIR implicitly, then we have to make sure that that also is taken into consideration. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide, we're certainly not alone in looking at policies and trying to work with policymakers to make changes. You can see that there's all of the 5B projects, so EOSC-Pillar and a number of others, and all of them have policy-related activities. But similarly, we know that many of the people in the clusters, the research clusters, which are working with the domains, are also looking at working on policy development. So I think there's a really good opportunity for us to work together to make sure that we can help the different stakeholders to refine their policies to make them more visible and comparable. If we can go on to the next slide. I wanted to touch again here that many of the policies talk about FAIR. And I think one of the things we can all agree on is that FAIR is quite a hard thing to define. It means different things to different people. there is a lot of work going on. So in FAIRsFAIR, we've been working to come up with some minimal viable metrics to assess fairness, and this builds on work being carried out by the RDA Fair Maturity Working Group and others. But again, we can't make these decisions on our own. We need to understand what different disciplines consider to be fair. And I think in relation to policy, what we need to understand is what is fair enough. If we're looking for a minimum viable set of criteria that will help us to determine if something is fair or not, we need to do that in conjunction with the different disciplines. And again, I think the cluster projects will be pretty crucial in helping us to do that. Vanessa also picked up on the fact that standard exceptions for not sharing data, most of the funders will allow you to not share data if it is going to breach data protection regulations or any other kind of sensitive data issue. But what we didn't see was a lot of consistency in how you might describe these data sharing exceptions. And I think that is something that we can collectively work towards as well. And not only to have that in the policy, but more importantly, reflected in the guidance so that researchers really know when they can say legitimately, I'm not able to share this, and to think about how they can describe that consistently. We can go into the next slide, please. The other point I think Vanessa picked up in our work is that we did see that data management planning is recommended by most of the funders and many of the institutions as well. What we didn't see quite so much of is this notion of updating them. Most of the people, most of the funders we looked at have a mandate to prepare a data management plan at the outset of the application. So when you're writing your application, you have your data management plan. This is definitely a good idea. We're not saying that that shouldn't happen. It helps you to flag up any issues that you have to consider. But what we would like to see is more the approach being taken under Horizon 2020 and by funders like the Swiss National Science Foundation, where there is an expectation that you will go back to your data management plan over the life cycle of your research and update it. What we would really like to see is what the Swiss National Science Foundation do, and they actually ask people in receipt of funding to publish an end-stage data management plan. So this reflects more what was done than what you plan to do. So it's a reflection on actions rather than an aspiration of what you were planning to do at the outset. And I think that sort of approach is something that we should be moving towards collectively. The other thing I think is key to pick up on is that turning FAIR into reality is very much focused on trying to move towards an ecosystem where people are rewarded for good practice. And I think definitely we're seeing moves in the right directions. Many of the national policies are starting to think about how they would do this and starting to build frameworks. I think Ireland and the Netherlands are good examples of this. Several funders are also looking to make this more of an issue. So the Wellcome Trust, for example, they have a requirement now where institutions who want to get funding from them have to be pretty evident that they're looking to sign up to DORA or a similar declaration. And these sorts of things are all very good, and we would always kind of fall on the emphasis being on rewarding good practice. But I think also we have to start to think about how we might introduce penalties for non-compliance. So we can't rely simply on reward. We also have to think in many ways about the deterrent. So there's a tricky balance to be reached, but we do have to start to think about these things collectively. If we can go on to the next slide, please. This is just to give you some links to some of the reference documents we've mentioned. So you can access the SPARC Europe and DCC Open Science Policy Analysis, plus the FAIRsFAIR Policy Landscape Analysis and our recommendations. And I think that's it for me, and we'll move on to the last slide. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to take them.
So thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And okay, if there are questions, now it is a good moment for you to ask. The ones in the Q&A were already answered during the presentations. So if there are no new questions, I think we can move to the panel session and work together with Joy and Vanessa, you already met. Other panelists will join us. So let me introduce Jan Hrušák, who's the ESFRI chair and the chair of the EOSC Landscape Working Group. Welcome, Jan. And Sverker Holmgren from the Guild, Marie Timmermann from Science Europe, Matthias Fingerhuth from FDM NRW, which is the State Initiative for Research Data Management in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. So welcome everybody. The first round of this panel is intended as an opportunity for the new panelists who just joined us to introduce their views on policies and their effects and importance from their different perspectives. As you see, we have people from universities, research performing organizations, funding organizations, national policymakers. So we try to cover all the sides of this important topic. So please, I'd like maybe we can start with Jan to provide some ideas on this.
Okay, thank you, Federica, and let me start with a disclaimer, because as you mentioned in my introduction, I'm sitting on several chairs, and therefore, for sake of simplicity, I prefer that everything what I say today is received as my personal opinion. It's not a contribution of ESFRI, it's not coming from the EOSC governance structure, neither it represents the position of the ministry where I am also legated to. So this allows me to speak a bit more openly and even be a bit more provocative, because I think that we are speaking here about policies, but we shall speak at the same level about communication of the different actors to design policies, which is a very, very important element in my view. Because without wanting to be cynical, I mean, policy, in my view, evolves from merit-based advice, which is then confronted with politics. And I mean, there are several sentences one could, in that sense, cite, and they would essentially say the same. So the critical aspect is really to provide merit-based information for political decisions, and this shall be in a form or another covered by policy. And when coming to the specificities of the policies we are speaking about, open science as a relatively new and still very evolving concept, and these particularities of let's say data management, data governance, data access, and all these technical things, with my ignorance, like data harmonization, the PIDs, and all the things, then one has to clearly say that in order to create an effective policy, and all the analysis by Vanessa and by Joy and by others have shown that we are still quite far from having a very clear picture on how such a policy shall look like. So much more communication is needed. And I think that what is at the moment really a little bit lagging is the vertical connection. So there is a life around the issue of open science, open fair data in the political domain, and there is a move around the same issues, let's say, among the stakeholders, among the scientists, among the service providers, among the research infrastructures, among all these communities, but this connection in between is still lagging, and this will, in my view, become a very critical element of success.
Thank you. This was really insightful, and I'm very curious about what would you like to propose to improve this critical area? Is there something we can do as projects, initiatives, at the national level or European?
I mean, the real problem is, and I'm living in a system where we are mimicking, and this is one of the reasons why I don't even want to be understood as representing a certain community. But we are living in a system which is pretty much performance oriented. And this goes to such a level that if also institutional funding, universities, research institutions, research infrastructures, the entire system is funded based on formal criteria which arise from a kind of science performance evaluation. And it would come as a natural element, and it came also in the discussion of or presentation of Vanessa and Joy, that if we introduce, and this is clearly a political measure, a rewarding system, which eventually also includes some penalties, then we would help the policy evolving. I'm not sure about that so much, because once this is strictly bound to funding, you will have a certain group of stakeholders whose funding will be terribly dependent on a seemingly well-performing within the given standards. And if these policy standards are not properly set, you are evoking a situation where gaming becomes the rule. And this shall not be our intention. So I'm a little bit afraid that this push for fast actions may have side effects which are not wishful. And in that sense, one shall really very carefully communicate bottom up and top down the intentions, the merits, the experience, the aims, the targets, and shall try to align that so that suits all the actors, even vertically, because there is really also a communication problem, and a part of that, there is also a problem that the rules which are used at the political policy level are not necessarily the same like strictly science-based logics. And this must be understood from both sides. So the entire process, in my view, must be very well prepared and designed so that the flow of information and the design of the policy is well funded. And this unfortunately requires time, and this contradicts a little bit the push we all are seeing.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much. I think we can move to Svenker. Please.
Yes, hello. So thank you very much. So I will follow up a little bit on what Jan has been saying, and essentially I agree with very much of what he brought forward here. And I will try to give a little bit of a picture from the factory floor. So from a university perspective, I am here now as a representative of the Guild, where I have my permanent position at Uppsala University. That's the member of the Guild. Actually, currently I am on leave on working at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden, and Chalmers is a member of CESAR, another network. So I think what I will say here is essentially true for universities in all of these networks. And I will try to give a little bit of a picture then coming from the perspective that I am currently working at Chalmers, being responsible for implementing something called Chalmers eCommons, which essentially is a local version of EOSC at Chalmers. So an integrated structure for everything that deals with data and analysis of data, including policies. And at the same time, it is the gateway to national efforts and to the European EOSC, which is an interesting situation. Of course, one thing that we immediately did at Chalmers is to apply for membership in the EOSC Association, which is then very natural for us. But let me say a few words about the role of policies. So at the moment, Chalmers has an old open access policy and no policy for research data. And of course, then we need to develop such policies, and there locally then. And there I think the most important part of this is the process leading up to the policy and the discussion and the anchoring in the research communities locally at Chalmers University of Technology. So there will be a lot of discussions. It has already started, and there will be a lot of knowledge awareness about the processes of open data, about FAIR, etc. I think that is actually the most important part of this policy that will eventually come out of this. Then the policy will of course be adopted by the rector of Chalmers University, and it will be a sort of both a top-down and a bottom-up process. But again, I want to stress this discussion and awareness that comes from actually creating a policy. Of course, then we have policies from funders. We have from the Swedish Research Council, the biggest research funder in Sweden. There is a mandate on open access, and there is sort of a recommendation on sharing of data. And this is important to researchers. They apply for funding from this council. They also apply for funding from the European Commission, Horizon 2020, and later Horizon Europe. And they will, of course, adopt to the policies set by these funders. But here I think it is also important to note that, and I think this is a little bit also what Jan said, the very best researchers, the top researchers, they have a choice of where to apply for funding. And if they can see that, okay, I cannot really work with the policies for open science that comes from this funder, I will apply for funding elsewhere. And there are usually options. And then that might result in a sort of a non-expected and unwanted selection of who actually applies to a certain funder. You might lose the best researchers. So I think this is an important aspect that should probably also be considered. In Sweden, there is no national policy. There is sort of an expression of a direction where to go. And probably there could be a little bit stronger statements, but I think eventually the main tool for implementing a national policy will be through the national funding agencies. So I think I will conclude there, and I would be happy to take part in further discussions on this.
Thank you, Sverker. And I think we can move to Marie now.
Okay, thank you very much. I've heard so many interesting things already. I would love to comment on some. Try to be short. Let me start with just a short explanation for those that don't know Science Europe, just to make clear on which behalf I'm speaking. Science Europe has a dual membership. We represent research funding organizations as well as research performing organizations other than universities. I've seen there was a question in the Q&A already on why research performing organizations haven't been included in the studies that were presented. So just to inform you that I will be speaking on behalf of funders and performing organizations. But at the same time, I will be speaking with the same voice, because the aim of Science Europe is actually to bring together the funders and the performing organizations and develop policies together that meet the needs of both stakeholder groups. The title of this webinar is the role of policies for a sustainable EOSC, and I think policies are essential for any movement that should foster open science, because they really have the potential to move things forward, especially when they are developed in a bottom-up, top-down common approach, which is what Science Europe tries to do. So we're trying to align policies of our members, of the funders and the performing organizations, while taking into account the need of the researchers and the scientific communities. So everything we do, and when we develop policies, especially on data management, which we did over the last years, we always try to consult the broader research stakeholder bubble, let's call it, to see whether what we develop with our experts, with our members' experts, is also usable for the broader research community. I said policies have the potential to move things. I think they do, but only when they're really aligned, and not if every organization and every country has its own policies. And that's something Science Europe has been working on and aiming for the last few years. We published quite a lot of guidance already to try and support different organizations, but also disciplines to develop their policies in a way that they are aligned. And I would like to come back to what Sverker said, that the good researchers will look for funders where it's, I guess, the easiest to comply with the requirements. What we're trying to do is to convince funders to align their policies. What we've done with one guidance, we've developed this also in close collaboration with the European Commission. We have quite some funders that have implemented this guidance already. And this very same guidance is also referenced in the Model Grant Agreement for Horizon 2020. So hopefully will be in the one for Horizon Europe as well. I would like to comment on a few things that Joy said from the FAIRsFAIR recommendations. There's a lot we agree with. The standardized exceptions for not sharing data, for example, we addressed this quite clearly in the guidance, that there are, of course, situations where it's not possible to publish your data, but then you really have to state why and explain why. We also agree with the fact that the DMP should be a living document. We've monitored what some of our members did over the last 1.5 years. The funders that implemented our guidance for data management plan core requirements already. And we've seen that there's different approaches. So we have funders that ask for a DMP already at the application stage of the project. We have funders that say the DMP needs to be ready once the project has started, once the funding is coming in. So there is a difference, and I think it's important that we keep these differences. The guidance should allow to align policies, but also needs to allow flexibility for the different organizational particularities. And this is why absolutely a DMP has to be a living document for researchers to think about data management from the very beginning, but they need to be able to adapt. But they also will need to be able to show these changes. There's one thing I am a bit reluctant, one of the recommendations that Joy mentioned, the rewards and penalties. Totally agree, rewards and incentives are, excuse me, absolutely needed, and Science Europe intends to look further into this topic as well. This is a known problem, I think, across the research community. We haven't thought as far as penalizing yet. We are more thinking about supporting researchers. So if a DMP appears to be not correct or incomplete or whatsoever, not to penalize a researcher, but to go back to the researcher and explain the lacks of a DMP, the points that are not addressed or not addressed correctly, and rather support the researcher and develop and have kind of a training and learning exercise while developing the DMP than penalizing. I think I'll keep it here. There's plenty more I could say, but
Thank you. I really like this focus on the researchers' needs. And yeah, I think that we have the same experience here, because a lot of time people stressed from the research environment, stressed the need for flexibility and frameworks that allow, for instance, temporary embargoes periods or other sorts of flexible tools to deal with this. So thank you for bringing in this point of view. I'd just like to move to Matthias now.
Yes, thank you. And I think my statement echoes some of the things that are already mentioned, specifically what Sverker said about the process of creating policy when it comes to universities. But I think I can also add a little more perspective on this. Because I think, well, maybe I start off by saying what I don't think policies do, because I don't think at the university level what a policy, when a policy is implemented, I don't think we should expect that from one day to the next, researchers are going to change the way they work. It may be very different with funding organizations, but these ways research works is very much determined by discipline-specific standards and conventions. And I think this also ties to the question of what is fair for a specific discipline. The disciplines need to decide themselves what actually these rules are. And so coming up with a policy and expecting everybody to comply with something that wasn't there yesterday or isn't even there today is very difficult, to say the least. So I think an aspect of creating policy on a university level is, on the one hand, the support that you can get from creating the policy through the different levels of university governments. But that also leads to a second element, which points to the need for services or support in creating these, or in performing these practices. But I think if you go through the process of drafting a policy at a university, that also means that administration or the governance body will be in a position to recognize that something needs to be established at this institution that needs to provide these services. And so once you have drafted a policy at a university, I think it's going to be much easier to provide such a service institution, some kind of research data services that then can support researchers in doing the required things to have fair data. And then also this interacts with the requirements by funders, because I think we saw that funders will not necessarily enforce the demands they have or check for compliance. And so I think it's a good practice to provide local support so that it's done in the best possible way. And I think by drafting policies, we can provide at least part of the resource or the resources that are needed for this.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. Before we move to the next question, I'd like to ask Joy and Vanessa if they want to comment on something that emerged in this round.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on the penalties and reward. I absolutely agree. We should always focus on trying to get people to improve because it's good practice and to reward that. The only thing I would say is that I think there's a risk if you don't penalize, and I'm talking about people who are serial non-compliant, so people who don't even make an effort to try and comply. If we don't really show that there are any consequences, I think there is a risk that the people who do comply will feel disincentivized. You know, why would you bother going to all the extra time and effort if it's clear that your peer down the hall who doesn't do this isn't penalized in any way? So I think, you know, it's like I said before, I think it's a really tricky balance, but I think we do need to start to think about how we might weigh those two things up, but absolutely focus on the reward wherever we can.
So I also agree with Marie and with what Joy said. The only thing is we also need to think about policy is there to accelerate change. So if we have EOSC and researchers are not using it and not contributing, I think Marie also said national policies are really important. But if you have a policy in place and nobody really follows through and just carries on, you have mechanisms you want to encourage. It's probably helpful to have mechanisms that maybe to change that behavior, but as a later resort. And does it work? So I asked the European Commission, so the Commission, they have a very strong policy in place. And I also asked them about compliance, and they do actually check compliance and monitor compliance with their policy, and they have 95% compliance. So, but what they do is they withdraw funding from those who are those serial non-compliers, if you like. So, okay, the European Commission is a very large funder, and they can probably, enforce such a ruling. It might be more difficult if you're a very small research organizational funder, but you know, so I wanted to say that, and then I really love that. I would love to have a longer conversation, maybe not today, but about finding. So Joy was talking about what's fair enough, or what's the minimal criteria if we're looking at a strong open science policy. And I think others were also talking about that. Oh yeah, that's right. So Marie was talking about alignment. So I think alignment is really important, but she also said, I think it was a Marie, that you also should respect some of those peculiarities and differences. So where do we find that balance between what should be that, you know, that basis where we all agree, and where is it flexible? So having that conversation, I think, would be really important. And it's a tough one, but yeah.
Thank you. Svenker wants to comment.
And also Jan, I see, but maybe we can do this in a sequence. So first of all, I think it should be clear that in my experience is that researchers really appreciate this alignment. So they really want that, and they apply to many different agencies, they get funding from different places, they participate in different collaborations, and they really want to see alignment. So that is clear. And then also a comment on this notion of rewards and penalties. So I think the key here is, of course, the rewards. So if, well, at least in Sweden, the meriting system is run by researchers. And if the researchers see that or identify that there is really a reward connected to open science, then they will automatically think that they want to participate in this and use open science techniques or systems. And in this context, I would like to say that words are important here. So there was a discussion on regulations earlier. Well, you have regulations, you have policies, and then you have guidelines. And I think guidelines goes much better when you talk to a researcher than talking about regulations. And especially if you can say guidelines to get you to the right rewards. That's really what the researcher wants to hear.
Yeah, I believe that if you can provide a motivation, someone before said that if you have a policy but nobody follows it, then you have to enforce it somehow. But I'd change this and say that if you have a policy and nobody is following, maybe you have a problem with your policy or with the way you communicate it. Because if the policy brings benefits, then probably people will be happily following it. So, and with this, I move to the next question, which is, how do we do? What happens if policies are adopted on one level, but not another? For instance, there are national policies, but not institutional, or vice versa. Do you have examples here or experiences?
Actually, I could comment on that if you want. Actually, we have a pretty good example within the countries of the EOSC-Pillar. So the guidance that Science Europe published in January 2019 is on core requirements for data management plans and for selecting repositories to securely store the data in. And especially the part on the data management plans has been picked up in the course of 2019 already by quite some national funding organizations. We published a study on these different approaches this year in January. And there's one example that I would love to stress, that's France. So the French funder, the Agence Nationale de Recherche in France, has taken the Science Europe guidance, has gathered other funders and other research stakeholders around the table. They decided together that they will follow this guidance, that they want to implement this countrywide. They've worked with the ministry, they translated the guide into French, and they looked for a provider to provide a DMP template online that researchers can use and develop their DMPs in line with this guidance, no matter which French institute they're in. And coming back again to what Sverker said, the fact that they gathered other funders around the table, I think makes it easy as well for researchers that might work with different funders in one country. And what we're trying to promote with Science Europe, of course, is that this alignment doesn't happen only within one country, but ideally across Europe. We see that our members that have implemented these guidance first on an institutional level, that they are talking and continue to talk to other stakeholders in their countries and try really to push this forward. So there's the French approach, they put everyone around the table from the beginning, that we do this together. And we have other approaches like in Austria, for example, FWF. They were one of the first ones to implement the Science Europe guidance. And I know that they're now talking with other research stakeholders in Austria as well to bring them on board.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wants to comment? Jan, I saw. Please, the floor is yours. You're mute.
Thank you. I have a difficulty to work with 3 screens and 1 mouse, so that's always a challenge. Colleagues, allow me to be again a bit provocative, because this question, as you are posting it, so the interplay between the 2 layers, let's say national and institutional policies, or national versus institutional policies, has certainly much more layers, and when we consider Europe, even 1 more at least. It's pretty much connected to that what I said in the beginning about gaming, and you shall be very careful not to introduce top-down too many policy measures which can be then misused. And we shall not forget that the entire story about EOSC, open science, open data, shall be done to the benefits of the researchers. And quite often we are, and this was also this part of the carrot and stick discussion we have had earlier. If we force the researchers too much to change the habits, we will meet resistance, and this resistance can be sizable and can be very destructive to the positive idea. And we have in Czech Republic now a long-standing experience with things which can go wrong, even though the intentions were very positive in the beginnings. So this is my experience, which asks for a bit more caution. It is also so that you place somehow the border or the ribbon to be crossed between the national policies and the institutional policies. While I have much more troubles with the European versus national policies, because there is in principle one European strategy for open science, maybe with some nuances and frictions internally, but there is many more national policies on open science in the European member states and associated countries, just simply reflecting the fact that we have a huge diversity of national research systems, and this must be properly accounted for. So even here, a very strong push towards alignment from very early stages on may be counterproductive. And one thing I cannot resist to say here is that, and I see that already for the 4 years I am meeting with the open science community, if I may say so, is the notion that the European Commission, with the few millions they have, or few hundreds of millions they have to their disposal, can finance the change. No, it's just a seed money, it's just an amplifier. But without a very strong national and institutional engagement at the country level, we cannot make it a success. So again, alignment is good, but too much push is sometimes counterproductive. And the last thing I want to say in this context is we shall utilize, and this is not done so much, even though most of you are very close to that. We shall not forget that monitoring has a very strong formative effect. So it's not just about following the development. It's also about showcasing good practice examples and forcing alignment of policies at the national level, institutional level, whatever level, and this is probably a very powerful but soft measure, which is not utilized so much at the moment.
Yeah, I think it was a very, very good point. Now we are short on time because the discussion was interesting and everybody provided useful comments. And so I need to move to the next question, which I think was partially introduced before, which are the consequences, positive and negative, for researchers. So incentives of rewards for complying and the consequences for not complying, the ones that were called the penalties, and to what extent the resources required for complying with policies should be reflected in the policies themselves. So is there someone who wants to further comment on this point?
I think there's a nice example, the Irish open science policy. They really also look at how one should reinvent the way that we evaluate research, because that really has to go together. So you don't see that very often in many of the policies. So I think they're really, I mean, we've just been talking about this really. It's so key to change the way that research is being evaluated, and then to reward research data and other outputs that are of significance for the disciplines.
Okay, thank you.
I think I'll just pick up on something that I'm not sure if it's completely related to this, but in terms of incentivizing good practice through policies, I think it's important for us to think about whose policies actually have the most influence on the researcher. And I think it tends to be the research funders, the publishers, and the research infrastructures. So where you want to do your work, where you want to publish your work, and who you want to pay for your work. Quite often your research institution is not really all that influential. And I think going back to what we heard about the point about the wording, I think particularly when you come to institutional policies, it can often be quite good if the institutional policy focuses on how they will help you as a researcher working here to be able to meet those other more stringent requirements from the people that you actually care about. So I think it's important to try and make sure you're really putting your effort into the policies that will make the most difference. And to be honest, I'm not sure the institutional policies are always the ones that make that difference.
So if I can make a quick comment there, I think this depends on the situation in the different countries. So in my country, Sweden, the main part of research is funded through block grants through the universities. So then their policy is the most influential one. And that is also the one which is sort of easiest to get a good connection to the actual researchers. So I think that could be an important aspect.
Yeah, in some countries, you may also want to include in your list the policy to access infrastructures like computing or storage or facilities.
I think that comes back to the fine line that Vanessa mentioned earlier, between how much can we align and how much flexibility do we need. I think the alignment needs to agree on what needs to be done, and the flexibility is the how.
Yeah, thank you. I like this. Sounds like a good selling pitch for open science.
Just going back to the institutional policies though, I mean, they are really essential because they are a very clear message that this is a priority for that institution. And though what also needs to be linked to that is funding to implement what Matthias was talking about, a service environment, infrastructure, activities, so that you can implement that policy. So I think we need policies on all sorts of levels. Sorry, some researchers are going to hate me for that. But yeah, I think that all of those working together will help us move forward.
Let me just come with a very brief comment, not to be forgotten. And this is, at the moment, we are just speaking about a kind of horizontal levels or opposite, vertical levels of policy alignment. So top down from the EU level to the department level or individual researchers' behavior. But we shall also not forget that there are certain research communities which may have entirely different community standards. And this is also something which must be considered when designing policies. So there are many more directions, and the model for this policy design is not as simple as it may look like at the first glance.
If I can just add something to the institutional aspects of policies, because I think it's very important to include something of a division of labor or division of responsibilities in a policy. I think it's not very productive to have a policy that says you should do this, you should do this, should do this, and just put it on the researcher without ever saying what the institution is going to do. Because I think the provision of the infrastructure is a fundamental aspect of good research data practices. You can have the best intentioned researchers and the most restrictive, draconian punishments if you don't comply. But if you don't have the infrastructures to do it, or the resources or the knowledge for that to implement them, it's going to fail. And I think including the division of labor, a university or research institution saying, we're going to do this, we're going to provide you with an environment where you can do this if you do your part. I think this is a very important aspect of drafting policy.
Yeah, if I may comment there, this is exactly what we are trying to do at Chalmers, as I said in the beginning. So we are building the infrastructure and the structures at the same time as developing the policy.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move forward with the discussion and to ask you why, in your opinion, the open access and open publication policies are so common compared to research data management or FAIR data policies, and what we can learn from these more established policies that we can bring home to establish EOSC and fairness at large.
Well, I think the simple answer is that research publications and the need to share these among researchers goes back far more in the past, and the importance of sharing data has been discussed only recently. And I think this whole open science movement is a paradigm change, and paradigm changes need time. And you have to start somewhere. The start has been with publications because it was the most obvious one, and the rest will follow. I think what we can learn from open access policies is really that it needs a structured approach, a joint approach. Sorry, coming back to the alignment again. And also to look at all the different contexts that Jan mentioned. You have the disciplinary needs, you have the institutions, you have the national policies, you have a huge EU framework of guidelines and laws, and all this needs to be taken into account, and whatever is done needs to be interoperable between all these different sub-aspects of the system. And then also coming back to an earlier discussion, we also then again need to take into account other aspects as assessment, rewards. I'm still reluctant to use the penalties. So this whole motivational aspect needs to be considered for all the different aspects as well. So it's always looking at the big picture, and I think we can learn a lot from open access and put this forward for other things.
Yeah, I think just a quick reminder that we're heading into the last few minutes of our webinar. Please go ahead.
I was just going to say I agree with Marie. I think we need to remember that open access has been around since the 1990s, and we're still not 100% compliance. So I think we really need to be realistic about how quickly we think this culture shift is going to happen, and particularly because it isn't quite as binary as having either open access or not. So I think it's a harder thing to do, and we have to give it sufficient time to get there. So I think we need to kind of be realistic about what we think we can do in such a short time.
Okay, thank you very much. Jan, would you like to comment?
sorry again. Let me come here with just one very ignorant and superficial comment. But I think that the parallels between open access to publication and open access to data, or even in general to open science, is not such easy to be made, because in fact what we are doing when allowing open access to publication is only to change the business model, how the publications are treated and how the information is accessed. While open science, or even access to open data or fair data, is an entirely new concept. And this concept is not well or sufficiently well understood by the scientific community, and it penetrates only very slowly to the political policy domain. And so we can use some parallels in order to speed up the process, but we shall remember that the development of open access to publications took us more than 20 years. And now we are pushing within 3 years to have an entirely new concept of open science implemented. So, you know, we shall be a little bit patient, and we shall try to do right things at the right time.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion and your contributions. I think we now have to wrap up because we are out of time. So it seems if I have to wrap up this discussion in a few words, I would say we need time, we need patience, we need more communication, vertical and horizontal, between different disciplines. We need to learn from what worked so far. We don't need very formal policies, but we need more motivation and flexibility and guidelines to do your work at the best. And we need time again. I know I said this already, but I think that Jan's last remark pretty much sums this. We are endeavoring is a big paradigm shift, and it needs time and people to join us. So I'd really like to thank our speakers and panelists to having joined us, and to thank our participants as well. The registrations and materials of this workshop will be available soon. In case you asked any question that wasn't answered yet, you will receive some response offline. Thank you very much.